In addition to the obvious impacts such as flooding and stronger storms, climate change stands to greatly affect economies across the globe. In the mid-April issue of the Business Journal, we talk with AJ Sumell, professor of environmental economics at Youngstown State University, about the impact climate change could have and is having on the local economy, and he joins us here today. Thank you for being here, AJ. So obviously everyone knows climate change means bad weather, but what are some of the impacts economically that climate change could have on us here locally and across the nation?
Right. So, I mean, everyone associates climate change with higher temperatures, increased flooding, right, rising sea levels, and that is certainly a big part of the problem of climate
that's
change.
a big problem.
Yeah,
right.
But regardless of where you live, everyone will feel the impacts of climate change. It's just a matter of the severity of the impacts depends on, whether you're near the coast or whether you're, down south where higher temperatures have a greater effect. But in general, the impacts of climate change will be not just about the weather, right? Because it affects the global climate, it affects the way industry functions, it affects consumer prices for various goods, in particular goods like insurance, because with increased severity of flooding and increased severity of storms, insurance companies will respond, and they are responding by increasing the price of insurance.
And for everybody.
For everybody,
not just if you live in a flood zone or whatever.
Yes,
you know what
exactly.
I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So prices will increase more, say, in areas like Florida or near the coast or down south. But insurance companies are national companies and sometimes international companies. And so if prices go up, if costs increase in any one area, it increases across the nation or potentially across the world.
What impact could that have? I know there's some studies out that talk about the impact it could have on our GDP in America. Could you share with us some of those projections or some of those estimates?
Sure. So this has been studied a huge amount in economics, and there are lots of different projections, all of which have shown a negative impact in terms of GDP. And forecasts, I'd point to probably the most seminal paper was done by an economist named Nicholas Stern called the Stern Review that showed that global GDP will be reduced by approximately 4% per year as a result of climate change.
Per year?
Per year. So if it's unabated, which means if we don't take significant action to try to mitigate the effects of climate change,
right,
GDP will be reduced by 4% per year forever. And to put that
I'm not
into
like
context,
a mathematician, but
yes.
that would seem like you're going to get into the negatives real quick. Like it's got to get to zero at some point.
To put that into context, so it's not necessarily compounding, but but to have a 4% reduction in GDP, the Great Recession in 2008 and through 10 saw a total of less than 2% reduction in GDP. So if we're talking about something that is more than twice as bad in terms of the reduction in GDP as the Great Recession, it is a pretty significant decrease.
Sure, and then twice as bad the following year also.
Correct, yes.
Right.
So it would be like a perennial, you can think of it as a perennial Great Recession forever.
Right.
But even worse.
So for somebody like myself who may have a hard time imagining how that would happen, could you give us maybe some examples of how climate change could just start basically destroying the economy?
Well, I mean,
we're going to say something positive eventually.
Yes, we will.
Yeah.
And there are positive things to say,
sure,
right? And this is, in a sense, the worst case scenario. So that should be pointed out. It means if we don't do anything and just allow greenhouse gas emissions to continue to increase as they currently are, this is what the projections would be. But the impacts are associated with, obviously, if sea levels rise, there's a huge effect in terms of just the fact that most people live on the coast and most business activity takes place on the coast.
Right.
And so there would have to be a significant change in terms of just economic activity, and it affects the ability to continue to produce where we are currently producing. But it's also very costly to try to mitigate the effects associated with that, and building things like flood mitigation measures and flood control and just rebuilding homes that are destroyed as a result of the increased flooding and the increased severity of storms, that is significant resources that would just reduce our ability to continue to produce in the way that we are.
Well, you just mentioned costs to mitigate all of these potential effects. I assume that the costs to mitigate them, while significant, are far less than the costs to do nothing.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. So if we just look at it from a basic cost-benefit perspective, the cost associated with taking action now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to implement mitigation measures are far less than the benefits that we would be expected to receive if we did not implement those same measures.
What about here locally? I remember a while back I saw something, it was talking about areas of the country and how they may be affected by climate change, and it looked, like 15, 20 years into the future. And here locally, it kind of like made my day. It was like, oh, this place won't be that bad. You know what I mean? The winters might get a little milder. You're near a lot of fresh water. So it was kind of like, yeah, that wouldn't be bad, but still, we need an economy.
Yeah.
So we're not going to be immune to all of the effects.
Exactly.
So I guess, what could the impact be here locally? And is there already, are we already being impacted?
So, I mean, geographically, we are relatively insulated to the effects of climate change. So we are in a good location in terms of we are less vulnerable to the effects because obviously we're not by the coast.
Right.
We're not in a area that's heavily affected by hurricanes, and we're less prone to flooding. But that doesn't mean we're completely immune. And every area will be affected in some way. So we will still have, not just milder winters, which is typically thought of as a good thing,
Sure,
right?
sure,
but
yeah.
we'll have hotter summers. But
Right.
we'll also have more severe storms, right?
Right.
And more rainfall and higher amounts of flooding that does occur. So it's certainly still worth it to take measures now and take action now to try to mitigate the impact in this area, even though we're less susceptible to that impact compared to areas along the coasts and down south.
Well, let's talk about some of the opportunities. I would imagine that industries that are built around countering climate change should be, have some growth projections. That should be a growing industry. And we happen to have a little bit of that here with Ultium cells and a lot of the electric vehicle manufacturing that's moving into the area. So I guess, where do we stand as far as opportunities for this? And are there opportunities out there that we should be going after, even other opportunities?
Absolutely, there are. I mean, and any mitigation strategy to reduce the impact of climate change has jobs associated with it, right? And so, and oftentimes those jobs are in some ways more attractive and more sustainable than jobs associated with, say, fossil fuels. And so obviously the big change that we've already seen and we will continue to see is in terms of manufacturing for electric vehicles and electric batteries for electric vehicles, and the impact of Ultium cells. But it's not just Ultium cells, right? The supply chain associated with that, the projections are, I believe, more than 8,000 jobs. Just
like 8,600, I think.
Yeah, just associated with Ultium cells, which is a really significant positive impact to the entire region as far as the economy. And then, of course, you have Lordstown Motors, which hopefully turns around and becomes sustainable and creates even more jobs there. But it's not just about the major, say, manufacturers. It's also about, like, if we invest more in green energy in general, or charging stations, or green buildings and green infrastructure, that there's, and say solar panels and solar panel installation, that there's jobs associated with all of those. And if we just look at, the fact is that green jobs, which means jobs that are intended to reduce our fossil fuel dependency, are more they generally pay higher, and the green industry is generally more labor intensive than the fossil fuel industry, so that there are more jobs in total on net when we increase the amount of green energy that we produce and reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we use.
So are there some examples of what other communities are doing? Are there other communities that are already doing this that we could take their lead?
Yeah, I mean, and if we just look at, there are obviously, I'd say, most of the cities along the coast are already taking measures to try to reduce the impacts associated with rising sea levels. But it's not just along the coast. And larger cities in this area have already implemented or developed and started to implement strategies to reduce the impacts of climate change. So you could just look at, what, say, Cleveland is doing, and their climate change proposals that they've already developed and started to implement. And they face, obviously, I'd say, they have a similar climate to this area and face similar challenges to this area. So things that they have done, I think we can look at as a model for what we could and should do in this area. If you look at their plan, I mean, they have everything from supporting green infrastructure, so preserving wetlands, preserving open spaces, so that when there is more rain intensity, that the nature is able to absorb that, and it doesn't just increase the amount of flooding in the area. But it's also a matter of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So supporting even bike lanes, supporting public transit, more energy efficient buildings. So yeah, there's lots of examples, but they're all intended to reduce the impact associated with climate change to residents of the area, as well as reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the area.
You can read more in the mid-April issue of the Business Journal, out today. Click subscribe at businessjournaldaily.com to see our plans and choose the one that's right for you.
717 Credit Union. Business services designed to meet your daily needs. Commercial loans, business deposits, merchant and payroll services. 717 Credit Union. It's knowing you were treated right every time.